to travel about 15 miles up the Orontes River off the Mediterranean coast, you would have approached one of the third largest city in the Roman Empire, Antioch of Syria, or Seleucid Antioch. It was a major trading city at the time. Many caravans would converge from the east through that city. It was populated at the time of Paul with about 500,000 citizens. Antioch was positioned beautifully with the river being built on the banks of the Orontes River, but also had the mountains off in the distance surrounding it, snow-capped mountains through the year. So it was a very attractive city. It was known as Antioch the Beautiful, or Antioch the Golden. It was an amazing location for the planting of a church. Christian believers from Jerusalem fled the persecution that developed there, and they came towards Antioch. And there they began preaching the gospel not only to the Jews in the synagogues, but also to Gentiles. And we're finding that the Gentiles were responding to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were coming to believe that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah sent from God, that the miracles that he performed were signs which signified that, yes, in fact, this is the Messiah. They trusted that his death on the cross was sufficient to atone for all of their sins, and they learned of his righteousness, his perfections, and how he stands in their place. His righteousness now clothes them, such that all their wickedness is covered by Christ's work. And so they came together and formed a joyful assembly of Christians. There might have been just one large congregation or a number of smaller congregations that developed within the city of Antioch, but in any case, it was a rather dynamic church there in Antioch. You had folks filled with the Spirit, people prophesying. You had mighty works being done within that community. You had those who were gifted in special ways of the Lord Jesus. Barnabas came to the city and saw the mighty work of God in their midst, then went to Tarsus to get Paul, a fairly recent convert, to bring him to Antioch to help out with the ministry there. And Paul spent some time there. We learn in Acts chapter 13 that the city of Antioch, the church in Antioch rather, became the, if you will, the launch pad for the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys. All three of his missionary journeys had their beginnings in the city of Antioch. So that congregation supported him as he went throughout Asia Minor and off into Greece and eventually even down as far as Rome. And so they had a missionary spirit about them, a concern for advancing the gospel in different cultures and different communities around the world. One of the great things about this church was that they had often gathered together for times of fellowship around a shared meal. It might have been the communion service in particular that the Apostle Paul was speaking of in this text, or it may have just been the agape meals or the fellowship meals that attracted the folks together for a time of fellowship. In any case, this was a thriving congregation, a mixed congregation of Jews and Gentiles coming together as one people of God. Now, the Apostle Peter from Jerusalem comes to visit this congregation to perhaps observe what is going on, see what God is doing among the Gentiles in particular, and see Antioch as a model perhaps for Christian fellowship and Christian churches going forward. So he comes and takes part in the life of the church there for some period of time, we're not sure. But Paul says that it was Peter's practice to sit with everyone in their times of church fellowship. Whether they were Jew or Gentile, Peter would sit with them and talk with them and learn of God's grace in their lives and tell them about what he knew of the Lord Jesus. But apparently there came from Jerusalem another set of observers, this time some from the more Judaistic bent of mind, those who were concerned about the law of Moses and the observance of that law. Paul notes that they came from James, probably probably not specifically representing James's point of view, perhaps more rather purportedly or claiming to be from James coming into the church. Some commentators feel that these who came from Jerusalem were very much concerned about the Jewish zealots and the nationalism that was developing in Judea, and the concern that these non-Christian Jewish folks had for these Christian communities that were being established around the world, and the kind of blurring of the lines between Jew and Gentile that was occurring there. Maybe they looked on Antioch as something of a liberal church, a liberal expression, going beyond what the law of Moses required. And so they came with an interest not only in seeing what's going on, but perhaps saying, we need to bring these people into line because they're going to break up or going to upset a lot of the Jewish people back at home and make life difficult for the churches. They brought pressure to bear on Peter in this regard. He was very sensitive to the safety and well-being of the Christian church there in Jerusalem, Judea, and so forth, and the hostilities that could quickly flash in that region. And so perhaps to accommodate them, to try to make peace, and to preserve the unity of the churches back in Judea, Peter began to withdraw himself or step back and separate himself from the Gentiles at their fellowship meals. He began to sit only with the Jews at this point in time, those who were concerned with the rituals and laws of Moses. Now, you might suggest that, he had an ironic purpose to this, a purpose of peace, resolving the problems back in Judea, keeping things settled there, and so he didn't want to make waves, and so he separated himself. I think that the language that Paul uses here of withdraw and separate is kind of, in part, military language, withdrawing from a front and retreating, going backwards. And then separation, of course, being that kind of a view of that holiness or ritualistic cleanness being placed upon Peter and those associated with him. In any case, Peter separates himself. Now, there are good occasions when we should work towards the peace of the church and be very concerned about the kinds of things we say or do which can have an impact upon others. And we should be very careful about our conduct in that regard. But Peter's actions here had repercussions, not just back in Jerusalem and Judea, but also among the Gentile churches in Antioch and throughout the rest of Paul's ministries. Paul had already been on his first missionary journey and planted churches throughout Asia Minor, and had returned and observed Peter separating himself now from the Gentiles. This would have a social impact upon the Gentiles, saying that perhaps they were unworthy, but not quite up to the standards of the Jews in Jerusalem. Or, which was Paul's concern, it might tell the Gentiles that belief in Jesus Christ was not sufficient for your salvation. You needed to add something else. You had to observe the law. You had to follow the rituals. And only when you do that, only when you live as a Jew, will you be saved. So Paul saw in this attempt on Peter's part to calm the waters as an abandonment of the very truths of the gospel itself. He says that he saw that Peter was clearly in the wrong. And then he goes on to say that he was not walking how does he put it? He's not walking straight to the truth of the gospel in the 14th verse there. Not walking in line with the truth of the gospel. It's an interesting word that he uses here in the Greek. It's orthopaduo, which describes, it's the word from which we get orthopedics, or an orthopedic doctor. A doctor who straightens your feet to make sure you're walking straight. And Paul uses that word to describe Peter's actions as not being in line with the truth of the gospel. The gospel was going this direction, but Peter was kind of wandering off like this. And Paul feels he had to confront Peter and confront him publicly. Listen, there were significant consequences to what Peter was doing, even among gentle souls like Barnabas. Barnabas, the one who was concerned to bring Paul into the fold and have him meet with the apostles. Barnabas, who was one of the first ones to get to Antioch and work with the congregation there. This one who was such an open, gentle soul, welcoming of others. Barnabas himself was following along with Peter and separating himself from the Gentiles. This was important to confront. And so Paul confronts Peter publicly, in the open, with what he's doing, because his conduct was public and out in the open. And he rebuked him, as Paul says, to his face. Paul's not trying to be disrespectful, Peter. Not trying to diminish his standing as an apostle by any way. He is trying to assert his own independence, verifying the fact that he himself is an apostle on equal footing with the apostle Peter, and so therefore he could confront Peter in this fashion. Calvin makes note that, yes, you could have inferiors, general believers confronting Peter about this sort of thing, but Paul's purpose for telling us this story is to remind us that he also is an apostle, and his apostleship is not derived from men, not from the apostles themselves or from Jerusalem. It's from Christ himself. And so, representing Christ and the truth of the gospel, he addresses Peter publicly, openly, before all others. Now, this is hard stuff. It's very difficult, first, to confront somebody even in private. But to do it publicly, openly, before others, as Paul did, takes some strength of character and some commitment to the truths which you are holding to.